She waited 41 years. 41 years waking up on the same dirt floor. 41 years serving the same family. Until they took everything she loved. She did not cry. Not that night. Not in the 41 nights that followed. Instead, she learned to wait.
To our legacy.
She waited for the moment when the legacy that destroyed her stood whole before her.
There are stories that history tries to swallow whole. Stories it buries beneath cotton fields, beneath auction records, beneath the careful silence of people who knew that speaking too loudly could cost them everything they had left. But some stories refuse to die. Some stories root themselves so deep into the soil that even after 100 years, even after 200, they push back up through the earth, demanding to be told. This is one of those stories. This is the story of Judah. It was the spring of 1800 in Marlborough County, South Carolina, a land of wide skies and relentless heat, where the smell of tobacco and turned soil clung to everything, where the sound of cicadas at dusk was so loud it felt like the land itself was screaming. The plantation was called Whitmore's Field, and it belonged to a man named Gerald Whitmore, a man of considerable wealth, considerable reputation, and considerable cruelty, though in the language of that time and place, men like him were called respectable. Judah was 24 years old that spring. She was tall for a woman of her time, with hands already marked by years of field work, though her eyes, dark and still as deep water, held something that no amount of labor had managed to extinguish. Intelligence, patience, a kind of inner fire that burned so low and so controlled that most people around her never even knew it was there. She was not the kind of woman who cried easily. She was not the kind of woman who broke. But she had brothers. Their names were Ezra and Solomon, and they were everything Judah loved most in this world. Ezra, 21 years old, broad-shouldered and quick to laugh, the kind of man who could find a reason to smile even when the sun burned too hot and the work never ended. Solomon, 19, quieter and more serious, with a gift for remembering things. Every hymn he ever heard, every story he was ever told, every constellation he had ever seen through the gaps in the slave quarters roof. They were her people, her blood, the two beating hearts she organized her entire life around protecting. And then Gerald Whitmore noticed them. It began subtly, the way all terrible things begin, with a seemingly small decision made by a man with too much power. Whitmore had a hobby, though that word is far too gentle for what it actually was. In the evenings when the work was done and the main house glowed with lantern light, Whitmore and his associates, other plantation owners, merchants, men of the county who thought themselves above the ordinary laws of decency, would gather in a barn at the back edge of the property, beyond the tree line where the main road couldn't see. They would bring liquor, they would bring money, and they would bring enslaved men whom they forced to fight each other while white men placed bets and cheered. These were not sporting competitions. There were no rules. There was no honor. There was only violence performed for the entertainment of men who had already decided that the people bleeding in front of them were not fully human. Ezra was brought to the barn for the first time on a Thursday night in April of 1800. Judah did not know until the next morning, when she saw the bruises on his arms and the way he winced when he reached for his morning work tools. He would not look at her when she asked what happened. He only shook his head, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the middle distance. Solomon stood beside him, pale with fear, already knowing that what had happened to Ezra was coming for him too. That morning,
Judah understood that something had broken in the world, something that could not be unbroken. She went to the fields that day, and she worked, because what else could she do? She picked and she carried and she moved through the motions of survival, while inside her chest something cold and precise began to form. Not anger, or not only anger, something more patient than anger. Something that understood that a woman with no weapons, no freedom, no legal existence in the eyes of the law, could not afford the luxury of rage that consumed itself in a single moment. She could not afford to act now and lose everything. She needed to think. She needed to wait. She needed to be the kind of dangerous that nobody saw coming. For 2 years, every Thursday night, Ezra and Solomon were taken to that barn. For 2 years, Judah watched her brothers return marked by bruises, by exhaustion, by a growing hollowness in their eyes that frightened her more than the physical wounds. She tended their injuries in silence, her hands steady even when her heart was not. She memorized the schedule. She memorized Whitmore's habits, his moods, his family, the rhythms of his household. She stored every observation like a woman assembling something in secret, piece by piece, in the dark. And then came the night that changed everything.
It was the summer of 1802. Whitmore had placed a large bet on Ezra winning his fight, a considerable sum against a rival plantation owner named Beaumont, whose enslaved fighter was said to be unbeatable. The night before the fight, Whitmore called Ezra to the main house and gave him his instructions clearly: win or face consequences that would extend beyond himself. What happened in that barn on that summer Friday was something Judah pieced together only afterward from fragments: a word from another enslaved person who had been forced to watch, a sound she heard carried on the night wind, a silence that lasted too long. Ezra refused to lose on purpose. Solomon, brought in to watch, refused to tell Whitmore that his brother would comply. They were both dead before morning. Judah stood at the edge of a field she could not leave, staring at the same soil she had always stared at, and she made a decision so quiet and so final that it barely felt like a decision at all. It felt more like a door closing, a lock turning, a woman folding her grief into the smallest possible shape and placing it somewhere inside herself where it would not rot, but wait. She would wait as long as she needed to. She had already learned how to wait. And so began the longest 41 years of anyone's life.
Grief, when it has nowhere to go, transforms. Judah had watched this happen to others around her. She had seen grief turn into despair, into surrender, into a kind of living death where a person continued to breathe and work and move through their days but was no longer truly present inside their own life. She had seen it hollow people out from the inside, leaving behind only the shell of someone who had once been whole. She refused this, not because she was made of something harder than other people, but because she understood that to hollow herself out would be to hand Gerald Whitmore yet another victory, and she had already given him enough. So she made grief into something else. She made it into attention. She began to study the Whitmore household with the kind of focus that only someone with absolutely nothing left to lose and one very specific thing left to gain could sustain over years. She noticed everything. She noticed that Gerald Whitmore drank his whiskey before noon on Sundays and became expansive and careless with his words. She noticed that his wife, Margaret Whitmore, a thin, pale woman who smelled perpetually of lavender water and mild disapproval, was frightened of her husband in ways she would never openly acknowledge and compensated by being cruel to the enslaved women in small, petty ways that she seemed to believe nobody noticed. Judah noticed. She noticed the way Margaret's hands shook slightly when Gerald raised his voice. She noticed the way Margaret's cruelty increased in the days following nights when the barn was lit. She noticed the children. In 1802, the same year she lost Ezra and Solomon, Margaret Whitmore gave birth to twin boys. They were born in September, just as the heat was beginning to ease, and the plantation celebrated their arrival with the particular fervor of a household whose patriarch had been waiting for heirs. Their names were Charles and William Whitmore. Gerald Whitmore had them baptized at the county church with great ceremony and considerable expense. He held a dinner for the county's leading families that lasted 3 days.
Judah stood at the periphery of all of it, serving and invisible, watching. She looked at those 2 infants, red-faced and wailing in their white lace christening clothes, and she felt something complicated move through her. Not tenderness, not hatred, but something precise and calculating that had no name she knew of. She filed them away in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered. As the boys grew, Judah's position in the household shifted. This was not accidental. Over the years, with a patience that never faltered, she had made herself indispensable. First in the fields, then in the laundry, then gradually, through demonstrated competence and an almost preternatural calm, in the house itself. By the time Charles and William were 5 years old, Judah had become one of the primary domestic workers in the Whitmore main house. By the time they were 10, she had specific responsibilities that brought her into regular contact with the family's food and drink preparation. She had understood from very early on that proximity was the first requirement of her plan. She learned everything she could about plants. This was not difficult. Enslaved people across the South had long maintained extensive practical knowledge of local flora, knowledge that had been brought from Africa and augmented through generations of necessity. She learned which roots soothed fever and which caused it. She learned what the old women in the quarters called the plants that the white families never thought to ask about. She learned slowly, carefully, asking questions framed as curiosity about healing, about remedies, about the natural world. She was patient in this as in everything else. She did not rush. She did not take notes in any form that could be found. She kept her education entirely inside her own mind, in that vast and ordered interior space she had built over years of silence. She also learned the rhythms of the boys. Charles was the elder twin by perhaps 20 minutes, and he had inherited his father's broad build and his father's ease in the world, the comfortable arrogance of a young man who had never had a single moment's doubt about his right to occupy space, to be served, to be obeyed. He was not unintelligent, but his intelligence was never troubled by self-questioning. William was quieter, with his mother's thin frame and something in his eyes that occasionally, in certain lights, looked almost like unease, as though some part of him sensed, without being able to articulate it, that the world he lived in was built on something that shouldn't hold. Judah watched this in William and felt nothing particular about it. An uncomfortable conscience that never produces action is worth no more than no conscience at all. The boys grew up around Judah the way wealthy white children in that world grew up around enslaved people, taking her presence entirely for granted, speaking freely in front of her as though she were furniture, having no idea what she was, or what she carried, or what she had decided long before they were born about their future. This was exactly what she needed. There was a woman in the quarters named Ruth, older than Judah, with a weathered face and hands that knew more about plants than almost anyone Judah had ever met. They were careful with each other at first, the way people are careful when the stakes are very high and trust is very expensive. But over time, slowly, something built between them. Ruth had her own losses, her own history of things that had been taken, and she recognized in Judah's quiet something she understood from the inside. One evening, by firelight, Ruth told Judah about arsenic. Not directly. Ruth was too wise for that. She spoke of it obliquely, in the language of those who know that walls have ears and that certain conversations need to be wrapped in other conversations to survive. She spoke of a family 2 counties over. She spoke of milk and rice. She spoke of patience rewarded. Judah listened without expression, her hands still in her lap. That night, she understood that the last piece had been placed. All that remained was the calendar,
and the calendar, for once in her life, was on her side. The twins' 18th birthday was a fixed point, a horizon she had been walking toward for so long that it had become more real to her than the present. 18 years old, the age at which Gerald Whitmore's sons would formally become men in the eyes of their world, heirs, inheritors, the future of everything their father had built on blood and pain and the bodies of men like Ezra and Solomon. It would be a celebration. There would be a special meal. There would be milk and rice, because it was a Whitmore family tradition for celebrations. She had watched it served at every significant occasion in that house for nearly 2 decades, always prepared in the kitchen where she worked. She had 41 years. She was in no hurry. If you were following Judah's story this far, leave your like below, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the moment. There are more stories like this one waiting for you.
No one plans alone for 41 years without the world pressing in around them, without other lives intersecting, complicating, demanding to be seen. Judah's story did not exist in isolation, though isolation was sometimes the only thing that kept it safe. There were people. There were always people. The one who came closest to understanding was a man named Amos. Amos arrived at Whitmore's field in the summer of 1808, sold from a plantation in Georgia following the death of his former master, whose estate had been liquidated to pay debts. He was perhaps 30 years old, compact and watchful, with a stillness that Judah recognized because she lived it herself. He had the bearing of someone who had long since learned to make himself small in spaces where being seen too clearly was dangerous. He was a skilled carpenter, and Whitmore had bought him for that skill, which meant he had slightly more physical freedom than many of the other enslaved people. He moved between tasks, between buildings, sometimes between neighboring properties, and he used that freedom the way Judah used her kitchen access, carefully and toward purposes that were entirely his own. They did not become friends quickly. Trust on that plantation, trust anywhere in that world, was a thing that had to be built stone by stone, tested before each new stone was added. They began with small exchanges, a word here, a look there, a shared silence that communicated without risking words. Over months, then years, a language developed between them that required almost no speech at all. Judah trusted Amos with nothing explicit. She trusted him with nothing she could not afford to lose, but she trusted him with her company, and that was not a small thing for a woman who had kept herself sealed for so long. Amos knew she carried something. He never asked what it was. This was the foundation of what they had. There was also a girl named Celia, brought to the plantation in 1815 when she was perhaps 12 years old. Celia attached herself to Judah with the particular desperation of a child who has recently lost everything familiar, and Judah, who had not allowed herself to become attached to anything since Ezra and Solomon, found, somewhat against her will, that she could not entirely harden herself against this child. Celia was quick and sharp and funny in a way that occasionally caught Judah off guard, producing a sound that surprised even Judah herself, something that might, in other circumstances, have been called a laugh. She was careful with Celia. She taught her things a woman needed to know in order to survive this world, but she kept the deeper architecture of herself entirely private. She could not afford to be known, not by Celia, not by anyone. Not yet. There is a particular loneliness in carrying a secret that you cannot share with anyone you love. Judah understood this loneliness the way she understood the heat, as simply part of the weather of her life, something you moved through because there was no other choice. Gerald Whitmore aged during these years. He did not age gracefully. The whiskey that had always been present in his life became more central to it as his 50s turned to 60s, and the cruelty that had always been a matter of casual exercise became sometimes more erratic, less controlled, which made him in some ways more frightening, because unpredictability in a man with absolute power is its own particular variety of terror. The barn fights had continued for some years after Ezra and Solomon, then gradually faded as Whitmore aged out of the energy required to organize them. But what replaced them was not mercy, merely a different expression of the same fundamental belief that the people around him existed entirely for his convenience. Judah watched him age. She watched his sons grow. She marked the years the way a person marks the passage of a long journey, not with impatience, but with the steady orientation of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has accepted that the road is long. Margaret Whitmore died in 1818 of a fever that moved through the county that summer, taking several lives. Her death produced a strange stillness in the household, a rearrangement of pressures and tensions, like a building shifting after one of its walls is removed. Gerald Whitmore did not grieve openly. The boys, 16 years old, moved through their mother's death with the particular stiffness of young men who had been taught that visible emotion was weakness. Judah prepared the food for the funeral gathering and served the guests and heard everything that was said and felt nothing about any of it that she permitted herself to examine. She was thinking about milk. She was thinking about rice. She was thinking about a September evening 2 years away. The county in these years was a particular kind of place, a society that had organized itself so completely around the institution of slavery that it had lost the ability to see the institution at all, the way you stop seeing the walls of a room you live in. White families visited each other and discussed cotton prices and church affairs and the weather and local politics, and the people who cooked their food and cleaned their houses and raised their children moved through it all entirely unseen. Judah moved through it all entirely unseen. She had perfected the particular art of invisibility that the world had been trying to force on her since birth, and she had turned it with characteristic patience into a weapon. Charles and William were growing into their father's image with the reliable momentum of privilege unchecked. Charles had his father's laugh, loud, consuming, accustomed to filling every room it entered. He had recently begun participating in the management of the plantation, riding out with his father to oversee the fields, learning the language of ownership that had been prepared for him since birth. William continued to exist in his father's shadow with what appeared to be contentment, though Judah occasionally noticed moments when his eyes went somewhere private and complicated. It didn't change anything. She watched him with the same measured attention she gave to everything. September 2020 was approaching. Amos one evening found her by the kitchen garden in the late light. He stood beside her for a long time, not speaking, looking at the same patch of ground she was looking at. Finally, he said only, "You've been looking at the calendar a long time." She didn't answer, but she didn't deny it either. He nodded once slowly, like a man acknowledging something that has been understood between two people for a long time without either of them saying it aloud. Some forms of loyalty don't require words, they only require presence.
The summer of 1820 arrived like all South Carolina summers, with a heat so thick and so physical that it seemed to press down on everything, slowing movement, thickening the air, making the distance between dawn and dusk feel endless. Judah was 65 years old. Her body carried the evidence of 4 decades of labor in ways she could no longer ignore. Her knees ached in the mornings. Her back required more careful management than it once had. Her hands, though still steady, had the roughened, knotted quality of wood that has been worked for a very long time. But her mind was precisely what it had always been: clear, patient, exact. She was almost there. September was the month of the twins' birthday, and in the Whitmore household, birthday celebrations were taken seriously, particularly this one. Gerald Whitmore, now in his late 60s and increasingly fragile in health, though not in temperament, had been planning the occasion for months. His sons would turn 18. They would be formally welcomed into the management of the estate.
There would be a gathering of county families, a dinner of considerable expense, a ceremony of passing the ledgers and the legal documents that represented the family's holdings. There would be speeches, there would be toasts. Gerald Whitmore had been talking about this evening since the boys were young, and in the final months before it arrived, he could speak of almost nothing else. The celebration dinner would begin at dusk. The first course would include, as it always did at Whitmore family occasions, milk and rice, a dish that had been in the family for generations, prepared always in the kitchen under Judah's hands. She had known this for years, she had planned around it for years, and now the years were almost done. The week before the birthday dinner, Judah moved through her work with a steadiness that felt almost outside herself, as though she were watching her own hands from a slight remove. She was careful. She was, if anything, more careful than she had ever been, more precise in her timing, more controlled in her expression, more thoroughly invisible in a household that had never looked at her closely anyway. She prepared the regular meals. She served the regular meals. She spoke when spoken to and was otherwise silent. She gave Gerald Whitmore and his sons nothing to notice. Amos found her that same evening. He had a way of appearing at the edges of her awareness in the moments when she needed another human presence, though he always kept careful distance, always maintained the architecture of plausible normalcy. He said nothing this time. He only passed close enough that their hands briefly touched, a contact so brief it was almost nothing, but wasn't. And then he was gone. She thought about Ezra. She thought about Solomon. She thought about a Thursday night 18 years before, when two young men had refused to betray each other or themselves and had paid for that refusal with everything. She thought about what it meant that she had spent 41 years carrying them with her, that they had been present in every season of her labor, every winter morning, every long summer afternoon in this kitchen, every meal she had prepared for a family that had taken everything from her. She had never put them down. She did not intend to put them down now. She thought about Gerald Whitmore watching his sons grow up, the pride he took in them, the future he saw in them, the legacy he planned to hand them. She thought about how a man like Gerald Whitmore thought about legacy, how he thought about continuation, how he thought his bloodline would extend itself forward into time, replicating his power and his name, carrying forward everything he had built. She thought, not everything a man plants grows the way he intends. The night before the birthday dinner, she lay on her sleeping mat in the quarters and looked at the ceiling and breathed slowly and deliberately, the way she had learned to breathe over decades when emotion threatened to overwhelm the control she needed to maintain. She thought of Ruth, dead now these several years, but present still in the knowledge she had passed along in firelight, in oblique language, with knowing eyes. She thought of everything Ruth had told her about arsenic, the dose, the timing, the vehicle, milk which masked the faint metallic quality, the rice which absorbed and carried. She thought about the word enough. She turned it over in her mind like an object with many surfaces. Not enough whiskey, enough patience, not enough money, enough time, enough. She had waited enough. She had carried enough. She had watched enough Sundays pass, enough birthdays, enough plantation dinners where Gerald Whitmore presided over a table surrounded by people who existed only in relation to his convenience.
Tomorrow, she would walk into that kitchen, and she would cook what she had always cooked, and then she would season it. If this story is finding something in you, if Judah's long waiting is touching something you recognize, please leave your like and share this video with someone who needs to hear a story about the cost of patience and the weight of grief. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next.
The morning of September 14th, 1820, arrived like a held breath. The air was still in the particular way that sometimes precedes a storm, not threatening exactly, but waiting. The sky held its blue at a slight distance, as though it too was watching. On the Whitmore plantation, the day began its routines with the characteristic efficiency of a household preparing for an event. Extra firewood brought to the kitchen, good china carried carefully from the cabinet where it lived between occasions. The dining room table extended to its full length and covered with the linen cloth that was only used for significant evenings. Gerald Whitmore had been awake since early morning. Judah knew this because she heard him moving through the house before the household generally rose, his distinctive shuffling step, heavier now than it once was, across the upstairs floorboards. She heard him cough. She heard him stop in what she had always understood to be the boys' doorway and stand there for a long moment in silence. She could not see him from where she was, but she had spent so many years in this house that she knew its sounds the way she knew her own breathing. She began her day's work. The kitchen in the Whitmore main house was a substantial room, separate, like most plantation kitchens of the era, from the main structure of the house, connected by a covered walkway that created a slight delay between preparation and serving. It was Judah's domain in the only meaningful sense that word had ever applied to anything in her life. She knew every surface, every vessel, every rhythm of light through its windows at different hours. She had cooked in this kitchen through 4 American presidents, through 2 wars, through the birth and death of more seasons than she had ever tried to count. It was the space where she had spent the majority of 41 years. In some terrible, complicated way, it was the closest thing she had to a place that was hers. She worked methodically through the morning, preparing the elements of the birthday dinner with the steady focus of someone who has done something so many times that the body knows the work without being told. She did not hurry. She did not allow herself any departure from her normal patterns of movement and behavior. She was aware in some distant part of herself that today of all days she needed to be exactly what she had always appeared to be, a woman doing her work, unhurried, unremarkable, entirely predictable. A girl named Patsy was assigned to help her in the kitchen that day, given the scale of the dinner. Patsy was young, perhaps 15, and moved through the space with the nervous energy of someone trying very hard to do everything correctly. Judah gave her the tasks that required simple attention and kept the important preparations in her own hands with the quiet authority of long experience. She thought about Ezra's laugh. She thought about Solomon's eyes. She held them in the kitchen with her like 2 steadying weights. Guests arrived in the early afternoon. Judah heard the sounds of their arrival, carriages on the drive, voices carrying across the heat. Gerald Whitmore's boom as he greeted his friends and neighbors, the lighter sounds of Charles and William being congratulated, being admired, being folded into the future their father had so carefully constructed for them. She heard all of this from the kitchen, and she moved through her work, and she did not need to go and see it to know exactly what it looked like. The dinner was to be served at 7. At 6:15, Judah prepared the milk and rice. Her hands were steady. She had expected this, had prepared herself for this moment for so long that her body seemed to understand before her mind consciously engaged that this was simply the next step in a journey that had begun before Charles and William were born, begun in the summer of grief and decision that had grown around the death of 2 young men who had refused to lose. Her hands moved with the calm of long practice. The kitchen was warm around her, smelling of wood smoke and the savory, rich scents of the full dinner in various stages of preparation. Patsy was tending something on the other side of the room, her back turned. The arsenic had been kept, not in the kitchen, not where it could be found, but in a place that only she knew, in a quantity so small and kept so carefully that it existed almost outside of reality, visible only to her. She had obtained it piece by piece over years through means that required patience and indirect routes she would take to her grave. She had learned exactly what Ruth had taught her about the dose, enough to be certain, specific enough to be targeted, the milk providing cover, the rice absorbing what was needed. She worked.
When it was done, she set the dish with the others and called Patsy to help her carry the first courses out. She did not look at the milk and rice differently than she looked at anything else in this kitchen over 1,000 evenings, and she carried it through the covered walkway toward the sound of voices and silverware and celebration. She thought, "This is the last time I will do this. One way or another, this is the last time." The dining room was full of light, candles and lamplight catching the good china and the crystal and the linen, making the whole scene glow with the warmth of a world that believed in itself completely. Gerald Whitmore sat at the head of the table, older and more fragile than the man she had spent 4 decades studying, but fundamentally unchanged in the way he occupied his space, as though the room existed to contain him, as though everyone in it existed to affirm him. Charles and William sat on either side of him, flushed with the attention of the occasion, the ease of young men who have never been given a reason to doubt their safety in any room they enter. Judah set the dish and withdrew. She did not stay to watch. She returned to the kitchen. She continued her work, moving through the remaining preparations with the same steady focus she had maintained all day. Patsy chattered about something, the weather, a song she liked, something trivial, and Judah responded in the brief syllables appropriate to a woman occupied with work. The sounds of the dinner drifted through the evening air, voices rising and falling, laughter, Gerald Whitmore's boom carrying even at this distance. She washed her hands in the basin by the window. She looked out at the evening sky, dark now, full of stars, the same stars she had looked at for 65 years, from every position a life like hers afforded, from fields, from quarters, from this kitchen window. She thought of her brothers. She said their names silently, the way she had said them every day for 41 years. Ezra, Solomon. She said, "It is done."
It was 3 days before anyone in the Whitmore household understood what had happened. The first signs appeared in the night following the birthday dinner. Discomfort, a heaviness, a wrongness that both young men initially attributed to having eaten and drunk too much at a long celebration. By the next morning it was clear that something was genuinely wrong. By the following night the county physician had been called. By the end of the 3rd day, both Charles and William Whitmore were dead. The house became a place of a different kind of noise, the jagged, disbelieving grief of a man who had lost, at a single stroke, everything he had spent a lifetime building forward. Gerald Whitmore's sounds during those days were sounds Judah had never heard him make before, sounds that didn't fit the architecture of the man she had studied, raw, broken, the sounds of someone whose certainty about the world had collapsed all at once, without warning, without preparation. She worked. She cooked the meals no one ate. She cleaned the surfaces that didn't need cleaning. She was, as she had always been, entirely invisible. The physician listed the cause of death as sudden illness. The language was imprecise, as it often was in that era for deaths that didn't fit expected patterns. There was talk among the county families, the kind of lowered voice speculative conversation that happens when something unexpected occurs in a world that prefers its events to be legible. Various explanations were proposed and debated. No one looked at the kitchen. No one looked at the woman who had cooked the meal. Why would they? They had never truly looked at her at all. This was the final, terrible irony of 41 years of careful invisibility. The same quality that had protected her plan was the quality that protected her afterward. She was not a person who warranted examination. She was furniture. She was function. She was as much a part of the background of Whitmore's field as the trees or the soil. The idea that she could be the author of anything, the idea that she had any interior life complex enough to produce intention, planning, decision, was simply outside the conceptual framework of everyone around her.
She was free in the only way that world would ever permit her to be free. Amos found her in the kitchen garden 3 days after the deaths, in the late afternoon light. He stood beside her for a long time, exactly as he had stood beside her so many times before, without speaking. When he finally spoke, he said only, "The road is done." "Yes," she said. They stood there together until the light changed. Gerald Whitmore survived his sons by less than a year. He died in the summer of 1821, alone in a way that wealth does not prevent and power cannot cure. A man whose future had evaporated, whose name would end with him, whose legacy was a plantation full of people he had never once thought to truly see. The estate was liquidated. The enslaved people of Whitmore's field were sold to other households, scattered across the county and beyond, their lives rearranged once again by the casual machinery of a world that treated human beings as inventory. Judah was 66 years old when she was sold. She survived. People like Judah, people with that particular combination of capability and determined endurance, often did, in the way that living through something is not the same as being unscathed by it, but is nevertheless its own form of victory. Celia, sold to a family in the next county, managed to send word through the informal networks that connected enslaved people across geography, a message that reached Judah perhaps a year after the dispersal. The message was 4 words: "I know, I understand." Judah received this message and held it for a long time before she decided what to do with it. Then she put it with the other things she kept in the private interior of herself, with Ezra's laugh, and Solomon's eyes, and Ruth's firelight knowledge, and Amos's steadying presence, and she carried it forward into the remaining years of her life, wherever those years took her. History does not record Judah's name beyond the ledgers where enslaved people were listed as property. It does not record her grief or her patience or the 41 years she spent turning loss into something with direction. It does not record what she thought about in the kitchen while the sounds of the birthday dinner drifted through the evening air. It records only Charles and William Whitmore, their birth and their death, and the dissolution of their father's estate. But some stories refuse to stay buried. Some stories told quietly through generations, through the particular oral traditions of people who survived by remembering what the official records would not preserve, find their way eventually into the light. This is one of those stories. Judah was not a saint. She was not a symbol. She was a woman who loved her brothers and lost them to the casual cruelty of a man who decided that her life and theirs existed solely for his benefit. She was a woman who understood that she had no legal recourse, no social recourse, no recourse of any kind available to her in the world she was born into. And she was a woman who decided, with full understanding of what she was deciding and what it would cost her, that she would find the one form of recourse the world had failed to take from her: time, patience, the long arithmetic of waiting for the right moment. Was she right? That is not a simple question, and it is not ours to answer easily. What she endured is not ours to judge. What she chose, after 41 years of carrying what had been taken from her, belongs to the complexity of a life lived under conditions most of us will never be asked to endure. What we can say is this: she was real. Her grief was real. Her love for Ezra and Solomon was real. And the 41 years she spent in that kitchen, waiting, watching, planning, those years were as real as any heroic act that history has been more willing to preserve and celebrate. Remember their names: Ezra, Solomon, and the woman who refused to let the world have the final word about what they were worth.
If Judah's story moved something in you, if these names mean something now that they didn't before, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel because there are more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories that history tried to erase, told the way they deserve to be told. Hit the notification bell so you never miss one. And carry Judah with you. Her patience, her love, her refusal to be nothing. She earned her place in your memory.